What would happen if an Ashigaru and a samurai were to fight to death? Let's find out. Hey number ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking. What is an Ashigaru? What is a samurai? And how different in terms of armor, weapons and skills are these two kinds of warriors? If there is one thing I love, it's how it glitters. Well, to answer this question properly, we need to first talk about what a samurai is and what an Ashigaru is, what sort of weapons and armor they would use, and the sort of skill level and training that these two kind of warriors/soldiers had. As always, if you like romance, knight, samurai, weapons and armor, become a noble one. Subscribe to my channel for more content from the Metatron. A samurai, obviously, it's an elite sort of warrior. It's a combatant, but it's also someone who is born a samurai. Japan had a very strict social structure. To put it plainly, it would look like a pyramid. At the very top of this pyramid, you would have the emperor. Then underneath that, you would have general court nobility. Then you would have the next scale, which would be the bushi, so the warriors. And in this scale, you would have the shogun, who is the commander of all armies in Japan. Then you would have underneath that the daimyo. You would have quite a few, and there would be warlords that would control a local territory, and underneath the daimyo, the direct servants or retainers, would be the samurai. So the samurai is, generally speaking, the lower rung inside the bushi, which is the second most important social class within this pyramid. Underneath that, you would have peasants, so we could say farmers, then craftsmen, and last, merchants. Now, it is also interesting how farmers, peasants, people working the land were immediately after, so they were quite important still within this sort of system. And the reason is because, of course, in a society like that of Japan, people that were producing food, well, they needed to be praised, they needed to feel important, and they were also, again, producing something. Craftsmen underneath that were also producing something, not something that is immediate or something that you need to survive, hence the farmers being above, but they were still producing something. The lowest rung would be that of the merchants, because merchants don't produce anything. They just get rich through selling and importing and exporting stuff produced by someone else. So that's why they will be the lowest. Now, as we enter the Edo Jidai, so the Edo period, also a new rung will be introduced, and that's the hinin, so the non-humans, the non-person, and that's someone who will be basically an outcast. Understanding this pyramid is very important, because if you noticed, I did not mention the Ashigaru. We understand where the samurai are, but where the heck are the Ashigaru within this pyramid? Here is when it gets interesting. The Ashigaru is a soldier. However, it's not a professional soldier until we get to the Sengoku period. So at the very beginning, probably in the Muromachi period, that's when Ashigaru started to become a thing more commonly. They will be kind of farmers that were called to serve as retainers to the samurai. So they were somewhat trained in very basic combat. They would use the sort of weapons and armor that was given to them, and we'll get back to this because it's very important. We're talking munition grade sort of armor and weapons, and then they will go to the front and fight for their lord. But what's interesting about the historical figure of the Ashigaru is the fact that he changes over time. And as we enter the Sengoku period of constant war between rising clans for hegemony over the Japanese Isles, that's when the Ashigaru starts to become more and more an actual professional soldier, someone who is trained, someone who is more and more heavily armored, starts to look more and more like a samurai, and people who work as Ashigaru professionally start to make some good money, and that's exactly in the Sengoku period that the Ashigaru start to become the backbone of any feudal Japanese army. Not anymore something added, but something that is the majority. So you would have elite corps, such as the samurai, followed by a huge amount of Ashigaru, or infantry troops. Even the term Ashigaru, well, ashi in Japanese means foot or feet, because Japanese doesn't distinguish between plural and singular, and the pronunciation goes up. Ashikarui means light, so light feet could be a good translation, meaning that they were the sort of infantry, or we could consider light infantry, although again, some would be quite heavily armored, but they are considered to be light infantry, light footmen. So we are in the Sengoku period. What is an Ashigaru? Is he a samurai? Is he a part of the bushi? Is he a farmer? Well, here's the thing. An Ashigaru is in between. And that's what really is strange, because it's an anomaly within a very well-structured system. But that shouldn't surprise us, because the pyramid that I showed you, it is finalized and introduced in the Edo period, in the Tokugawa period by the Tokugawa shogunate, and for a specific reason. Think about it, the Sengoku period finishes with the incredibly famous battle of Sekigahara, a very famous battle between Tokugawa Ieyasu and Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Now, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, so Tokugawa Ieyasu's opponent, he was a lowborn who rose to power and authority. So it shouldn't surprise us that the Tokugawa shogunate, as soon as they got power, they decided we need to make sure that that is not going to happen ever again. Highborn, lowborn, let's make sure everyone understands this. So how was the social structure before? It was present. It just wasn't as strict. The very first loose attempts at creating a very organized and strict social structure started in 645 during the Taika reforms. So we know that Japan had been trying for a long time, and I'm sure that people understood that the samurai, the bushi were their superiors, but it wasn't as clearly defined. It is in the Tokugawa period that it's clearly defined. So the fact that the Ashigaru before don't really fit is not a problem, because in the Muromachi period and in the Sengoku period, the social structure and division in Japan wasn't as firmly established as it will be afterwards. But as soon as that's organized and established, what happens to the Ashigaru? Formally and officially, Ashigaru will always remain a sort of in-between, between the farmers and the bushi. They are not considered bushi, even though there are some areas of Japan where we know, and it has been attested and documented, that some professional Ashigaru became bushi, but it wasn't as common. You really had to be an extremely successful and wealthy Ashigaru to get to the point where they would nominate you as a bushi. Now that we have understood this, what would happen if you put a samurai and an Ashigaru into a fatal duel? And now I know that a lot of people might think, well, that's an easy answer. Obviously, samurai is an elite kind of warrior, so he's going to destroy the Ashigaru. And yet, the Battle of Nagashino disagrees. See, in the Battle of Nagashino, which is again a very important battle in the history of Japan, of feudal Japan at war, we have the Takeda clan, one of the most fearsome Japanese feudal clans, facing in combat the Oda clan. Now, one of the characteristics of the Takeda war machine was their ability to annihilate their opponents with heavy samurai cavalry charges. They were famous for that. And yet the Oda clan, led by Oda Nobunaga, will succeed at defeating the Takeda using strategically placed Ashigaru gunners that will render the Takeda cavalry charges useless because of these Tanegashima Teppo matchlock type arquebuses. Given Oda Nobunaga didn't just give these to his Ashigaru troops, he also gave these to samurai in his army. And in general, in the Sengoku Jidai, we are talking about a ratio of 2 guns for every bow at the beginning, which will then be increased to 4 guns for each bow. Honestly, if Oda Nobunaga could have given these to any cat and dog in his domain, he would have. This is where I think we need to decide, are we talking about a one-on-one duel or are we talking about a battle? Well, of course we're talking about both. In a one-on-one duel, in the majority of cases, my money would be on a samurai. If we're talking about a samurai veteran, even against an Ashigaru veteran. However, if we're talking about an Ashigaru veteran against a new samurai, someone who isn't very good, is just born into the caste but has never really seen much battle, then the fact that he's samurai doesn't really mean much. Now, of course, if you are samurai and you are rich, which I mean can happen and cannot happen, but if that is the case, then the sort of armor and weapons, the quality that the samurai caste at its upper level, so the sort of higher echelons of warrior societies could afford, could never be afforded by a Ashigaru. You would never see an Ashigaru in Oyuroi. But if we're talking about a poor samurai, and of course there were some like that, who couldn't really afford a very good kind of equipment, and he doesn't have much experience in combat either, and you place him into a one-on-one duel to death with an Ashigaru who has years of battle experience, he's wealthy because he has survived and he has served well as a retainer his samurai, and he has bought himself a very good quality armor, then I want to say my money's on the Ashigaru. And when I say that Ashigaru couldn't afford Oyuroi, there is another thing I'd like to say about that. There are many many different kinds of samurai armor, or in general, armor that was used in battle in Japan. The oyoroi, the sort of older classical kind of armor, even though it was extremely protective, it was also extremely heavy. And oftentimes when we think of the samurai, we think of this kind of armor. Now, yes, it's made of steel. At the time, it would have been made of iron or sometimes steel, depending on, again, the wealth of the samurai. It's lacquered, obviously, but this is a Tosei Gusoku. It's a 16th century kind of armor that we would see on the battlefield in the Sengoku period. It does have some weight, but it's quite light in its basic configuration. But an oyoroi would be heavy, and sometimes some samurai, even though they could afford an oyoroi, they would rather wear something like an Omaru, so a sort of armor that was usually used by lower ranking samurai, that was a lot lighter, it would still grant good protection, and it wouldn't weigh as much. So we can see that sometimes just the fact that you've got money doesn't mean you're going to buy the most expensive things out there, and an Omaru could be used by a Ashigaru. In fact, even the Tosei Gusoku would be used by an Ashigaru. However, a massive caveat that I do need to make is even though armor might look similar, it doesn't mean that it's the same. For example, yes, you could see a samurai in a Tosei Gusoku like mine and an Ashigaru in a very similar Tosei Gusoku. Sometimes the Ashigaru wouldn't wear this sword, protection of the shoulders, other times they would. Sometimes the Ashigaru would wear the sort of headgear or protection called jingasa. It's typical. It basically looks like the sort of straw hats worn by farmers, with the only difference that it will be made of paper, leather, iron, steel. But we shouldn't think that that sort of helmet is only used by Ashigaru, because sometimes samurai use them too. And on the other side of the spectrum, this kind of helmet, a Kabuto, could be worn by an Ashigaru if he had the money to buy it. This is not the sort of helmet that only the samurai could use, and the reason is quite simple. If you are a warlord, you want to make sure, if you have the money, that you equip your soldiers with the best things you can, and then if said soldiers have their own money and they want to upgrade their equipment, please go ahead. However, in general terms, even though an Ashigaru could be wearing a Kabuto, could be wearing a do with sode and full arm, the kote, again, it would be, in the majority of cases, munition level armor. So a sort of armor that would be mass produced and then given out, handed out to the soldiers, which is very different to a very well made, specifically tailored suit of armor made for a wealthy samurai. Not only because when a suit of armor is properly tailored, even though the overall weight might be similar to a off-the-shelf one, it would work a lot better and it would feel a lot lighter. But again, as we said, some samurai could afford actual steel plates and even bulletproof armor, which was called Tameshi Gusoku, that was so resistant and well made that could stop arquebus bolts. I would not trust munition grade off-the-shelf Ashigaru armor to do that. So for a one-on-one duel, if it's a wealthy samurai with very good gear and good battle experience against an Ashigaru with, generally speaking, low quality munition grade sort of equipment, then my money's on the samurai. And in terms of skill, a samurai would have a lot more free time to practice. An Ashigaru, depending on what period we were talking about, would also have to farm the land. On a battlefield, however, the situation is different because, as I said, sometimes Ashigaru gunners particularly were employed very well. And in the Sengoku Jidai is when battle starts to look differently. You don't have people just randomly selecting an opponent and having a one-on-one combat situation like it used to be before. You have en masse formation battles of masked spearmen and then of course the gunmen. You can be the strongest, most high-born samurai on the planet. If a low-born Ashigaru shoots you in the face, you're dead. While in early periods, there would be a more significant difference between a corps or samurai, a unit of samurai fighting against a unit of Ashigaru, with the samurai having a huge advantage. As we move into the late Sengoku period, and Ashigaru are now becoming professional soldiers, very similarly equipped to the samurai, and using very powerful weapons such as the Tanegashima Teppo, then the situation will very much depend on tactics and strategy. It's never really black and white. It is this multitude of shades of grey that represent the wide range of variables that define battle, that make it interesting, complex, and intriguing. Alright, but I hope that you noble ones enjoyed this video. If it did, please remember, thumbs up and share it with your friends. And don't forget to click the notification bell to never miss content from the Metatron. Thank you very much for watching, and remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.